Hello everyone, my name is Maniki Alistar and this is a pre-recorded talk for the Australasian Mathematical Psychology Conference 2021. The title of this talk is How Do We Choose Our Giants? Perceptions of Replicability in Psychological Science. This talk is based on a registered report which we're just in the process of finalising and is joint work with Rain Vickers-Jones, David K. Sewell and Timothy Ballard. You can see all of the materials for this talk, including the full survey and stage 1 manuscript, on the OSF link on the slide. So the starting point for this project come from several large-scale attempts to replicate previous findings not being especially encouraging. While any single failure to replicate could be due to a range of non-problematic reasons, a lot of people have argued that this mounting evidence is indicative of a systematic issue, causing many to lose confidence in the robustness of psychological findings. In response, there's been a number of proposed changes aimed at improving the overall standard of psychological research. For example, some have advocated for pre-registration or registered reports, open sharing of data and methods, or increasing sample size. Other proposed changes include lowering the criterion for significance, transitioning to Bayesian statistical methods, or changing the way that we theorize by perhaps advocating for more formal theorizing. However, while there seems to have been an uptake in these practices in recent years, we still don't know how they affect researchers' confidence that a finding will replicate. In other words, does following these practices improve researchers' confidence in the replicability of that result? This is important because judgments of replicability are vital to scientific progress. In our paper, we use the metaphor standing on the shoulder of giants to encapsulate how new discoveries are built on knowledge generated by previous discoveries. In order for this cumulative process to be successful, psychological scientists must be able to effectively evaluate the robustness of the knowledge on which they attempt to build. Therefore, this begs the question, how do we choose our giants, and are we choosing them appropriately? The aim of this study was to understand how different research practices influence psychological scientists' confidence in the replicability of a finding. This was broken down into three main research questions. Firstly, what factors influence psychological scientists' perceptions of replicability? Secondly, are there distinct themes that people consider when making these evaluations? And thirdly, are there individual differences in the profiles of beliefs that people hold regarding replicability? Using a method based off Field et al. 2018, we surveyed corresponding authors of articles published in psychology journals between 2014 and 2018. We asked them, without knowing anything else about the original study, to what extent would the following pieces of information change your level of confidence that a high-powered replication attempt would yield the same result as the original study? They were asked to give these confidence ratings for 76 different study attributes that covered a range of areas from information about the statistical tests, such as the p-value or effect size, to information about the methods, such as the recruitment procedure or sample size, to the subdiscipline it was published in, all the way to features about the authors themselves. We sent 5,000 of these surveys out and ended up with a final sample of 503 participants. And that response rate was pretty much in line with what Field et al. Found with their procedure as well. So this is a plot showing the distribution of confidence ratings for each item, rank ordered from the greatest increase in confidence to the greatest decrease in confidence. Among the features that seemed to increase confidence the most were the existence of previous replications, high power, openly available data and methods, the phenomenon being robust across contexts, and the original study being pre-registered or a registered report. Attributes that didn't seem to influence confidence that much tended to include features about the authors themselves, so like their reputation, seniority, or institution. And then the features which seemed to decrease confidence the most were the original study having low power or p-values that were just below significance, not making methods and data available, or having results that were surprising or complex in some way, like a three-way interaction. So those descriptors helped to answer the first research question about which features influence confidence in the replicability of a study. But next we performed a Bayesian exploratory factor analysis aimed at assessing whether there were any distinct themes that people consider when evaluating replicability. The analysis revealed a 6-factor structure, although some of the factors were quite highly correlated. That being said, we did identify reasonably distinct themes in each of the factors. The first factor contained items that might have indicated the original study would be fairly easy to replicate. Some of the highest loading items were the existence of previous replications, open data and methods, and a representative sample. The second factor seemed to contain items one could argue indicate a rigorous analysis, like the original study having high statistical power, a large sample, or the analyses being pre-planned or pre-registered. Interestingly, the original study being from cognitive psychology or quantitative psychology also loaded onto this factor. The third factor contained items which might indicate robust conclusions in the original study. So the phenomenon is robust across contexts, a large effect size, consistency with prior research or theory, multiple experiments, and the use of Bayesian analyses. Interestingly, having the original study published in a high impact factor journal loads negatively onto this factor as well. The fourth factor was the hardest for us to determine a coherent theme, and it also explained the least amount of variance out of the 6 factors. But in general, we thought that the items on this factor might indicate a preference for established convention. So it contained items that related to traditional markers of replicability, like established statistical methods, the original study coming from a senior research team or an institution with a strong reputation for research, or the result being a classic finding. Again, though, we found this one to be quite difficult to come up with a coherent theme, so definitely take it with a healthy grain of salt. The fifth factor had a lot of items loading onto it, but we thought that many of them seemed to indicate a potential for harking, so hypothesizing after the results are known. It contained items relating to the results that were complex, surprising, or just barely meeting the threshold of significance, and also analyses that were post hoc or from studies that weren't pre-registered. This was the factor which also included the most subdisciplines, with the highest loading being from social psychology, but also evolutionary, clinical psychology, neuroscience, health, developmental, and industrial or organizational psychology. Lastly, we thought that factor 6 seemed to contain items which might be indicative of a lack of robustness. So low power, not making methods and data available, context dependence of results, or the use of a convenience sample. And so our final research question pertained to whether there were any individual differences in how people responded to these factors. So do some people, for example, say care more about pre-registration, whereas maybe others care more about sample size? For this, we performed a cluster analysis using a Gaussian mixture modeling approach. The analysis revealed 3 clusters which tended to differ more in people's strengths of responses rather than the direction of their responses. So the first 2 clusters, which are in red and blue respectively, we called highly sensitive and moderately sensitive responders, and they made up the vast majority of the sample. As the name suggests, highly sensitive responders tended to have quite pronounced changes in confidence upon hearing about different features, a bit more than moderately sensitive responders, although they both tended to be in the same direction. The third factor in green, which only made up about 6% of the sample, we called insensitive responders because their opinions didn't change that much at all upon finding out different pieces of information. This group was also quite a bit more variable than the other 2 clusters, But one interesting distinction was that they seemed to be systematically less dissuaded by the potential for harking factor. So the broad aim of this project was to get a better understanding of how different features of a research project influence psychological scientists' confidence in the replicability of a finding. We identified 6 somewhat distinct themes that people might consider when evaluating replicability, and that people tended to differ in the extent to which they relied on these themes rather than the actual themes that they used. Interestingly, we found that the attitudes of our sample aligned reasonably well to what large-scale replication attempts have actually shown are associated with replicability. For example, a common theme found in these replication attempts was that a larger effect size, larger sample, and a smaller p-value in the original study were independently associated with a higher probability that the original study would successfully replicate, which seemed to be pretty accurately reflected in the confidence ratings of our sample. We also found that many open science and other proposed changes to research practice, like making data and methods openly available, pre-registration and registered reports, as well as the implementation of Bayesian methodology or lowering the criterion of significance, seem to increase researchers' confidence in a finding overall. It's important to note, however, that the efficacy of these practices is still debated. For example, despite our sample having quite a lot of confidence in pre-registration, there have been many recent criticisms about its actual utility. We hope that our research might be useful at indicating whether there is a mismatch between the perceived efficacy of research practices and their actual efficacy, which will hopefully guide debates about where to focus our methodological reform. So this was a very preliminary exploratory study, and we think that there are a lot of interesting avenues that could be built upon this research. One interesting direction could be to look at moderating factors. For example, people might not care so much about statistical analyses as long as the original study has a large enough sample size. It could also be worth seeing if there are any individual differences in the factor structure itself. We assumed that one factor structure applied to all participants, but it could certainly be plausible that different types of scientists group information together in different ways. Lastly, I just wanted to add a quick disclaimer that replicable research doesn't necessarily mean robust research. This project, and indeed much of the debates about how to improve the quality of psychological research, has focused on improving replicability. But there are a lot of excellent perspectives on improving the standard of psychological research that are not necessarily concerned with improving the replicability of individual studies, and instead, for example, emphasize more rigorous theory building. Thank you very much for listening.